Welcome to my Civil War videos. I'm producing these for 4-H. I work for Boone County 4-H and I'm producing these for my 5th grade students, but I hope that you'll enjoy them as well and be able to watch all the videos that I've presented on the American Civil War. The first video we're going to look at is going to talk a lot about the motives that the Union soldiers had for enlisting in the war. In 1860, many men in the North lived isolated lives on isolated farms or living in isolated communities throughout the United States. And at that time, most men in the North and people generally had no idea that the Civil War was coming. They'd been through many issues related to tensions between the North and the South and government tensions. They'd seen that all before. They thought this would just be another year where they would somehow get by, and most people were just trying to live their lives and do the things that they normally would do as farmers and people living in their small communities. But in November 1860, Abraham Lincoln is elected President of the United States. And the southern states saw this as a threat to their economic, their moral, their cultural way of life. And because of that threat and the mounting tensions that had happened throughout the years, in December of 1860, South Carolina secedes, and following them, 9 other states will actually break away. And ultimately, when it's all said and done, there are 11 states that will join the Confederate States of America. And they'll form their own nation in a sense. They'll have their own president, constitution, Congress. For about 4 years, they are, in fact, their own nation. By early 1861, tensions between the United States and the newly formed Confederate States begins to mount, and the tensions grow stronger. One of the biggest issues was the fact that there were several forts along the southern coastline that were still in federally hands as far as occupation, and the South didn't like it. They had petitioned the North several times to remove themselves from those forts, allowing the Confederate States to take over those forts as their own, and the United States refused to do so. On April the 12th, 1861, the Confederacy fires on Fort Sumter in the Charleston Harbor, and the Civil War begins. After this, Abraham Lincoln calls for 75,000 men in the North to enlist and be able to come and serve to put down the rebellion in the South. Men in the North had a lot of sort of motivations for going off and fighting. Probably one of the biggest ones was just patriotic excitement. This idea that, hey, I'm in a small town and community, all my friends are going to enlist, we're going to be in the same company, and we're going to go off and we're going to fight. And they didn't have any idea of the dangers, because in 1861, no one believed the war was going to last 4 years, that 650,000 people would die during the Civil War. They just couldn't even fathom that. And the politicians, both North and South, and the newspaper men were saying 90 days war, and then this thing will all be done, and we'll be home, and we'll have had some fun, and it's not going to be a big deal at all. And obviously from history we know that that's not the case. Not only was it patriotic fervor, but there were people in the North that had a mindset really toward a higher cause. You know, Abraham Lincoln was saying things like, we're going to fight this war to preserve and save the Union, and there's a lot of people North and South, or in the North that is, who would have fought to preserve the Union and want to keep it whole. Their fathers and grandfathers fought in the Revolution to be able to set up a government based on this potential promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And sure, at that time it wasn't perfect, but it was a system in government that couldn't be found anywhere else in the world in the 19th century. And so a lot of men will go off and fight because they have an ideology related to preserving the Union. Let's save this nation that's built on these promises that the Constitution is built on, so that we can leave a nation that not only we can thrive in, but our children and grandchildren. Many would enlist just to impress a sweetheart. A lot of young men in small towns that have a lady that maybe they liked and would one day wish to marry. And so going off and fighting would be a motive, because you'd want to go off and fight, come back a hero, and that sweetheart want to marry you. Sometimes it was related to peer pressure from the town's point of view. A lot of young men in this time in American history, if you're needed to go off and fight to help save your nation, it was expected for you to enlist. And if you didn't go off and fight, you might be labeled a coward. Some men actually did get that label during the Civil War. There's all kinds of motives. At the beginning of the war, 2% of the nation in the North was motivated to go to fight to end slavery, and obviously that's an issue. Now, it's not as big an issue at the beginning of the war, and let's be honest, in American history, a lot of times the people in the North could be as racist from our point of view today as they were in the South, sometimes even more so. So we said a few minutes ago that one of the primary motives for soldiers enlisting in the Civil War at the beginning from the Union side was to fight to save the Union. The fact that the Constitution of the United States made promises that were worth fighting and worth dying for. And I kind of indicated that slavery itself wasn't a huge issue or motive for men in the North to enlist and fight, and that was very true. But what about the slavery issue? Because obviously it was a big issue. Why is it that a lot of soldiers in the North didn't actually go and fight to end slavery? The statistics roughly say that about 2% of men in the North would have enlisted to fight to end slavery. It just wasn't an issue for them. And as we said earlier, unfortunately by our standard today, most people North and South, by our definition today, were considered extremely racist at that time. There were things that made slavery a big part of the Civil War, and we're going to talk about that here in just a little bit in another video. But just suffice to say, most men in the North, they didn't go to fight to try to end slavery. They were fighting to save the Union. Now, I will say that as the war progresses, there are accounts of men in the North who are in the armies moving south where their minds sort of begin to shift toward this idea of, yes, it's a good thing slavery's ending, because they begin to look at the slavery issue in the South, and they will see moments of brutality, moments of seeing slaves in the lives that they lived, and some do come to the realization that the moral fight here is actually a really good thing. Some begin to see the idea of ending slavery being just like some of the government's ideas about ending slavery, which is that it was an act that would hurt the South economically, and their ability to continue to wage the war would be greatly diminished if slavery is ended, the slaves are free, and you begin to cause those kind of things to happen. And so many men in the North, even though they might not have really cared so much about African American people from that point of view of sort of equality and things like that, they definitely saw the reasoning behind ending slavery as a military action. Some men would never come to the conclusion that it was okay. Matter of fact, when the Emancipation Proclamation is issued, a lot of men, especially in areas like Indiana, Illinois, Kentucky, would threaten to desert. They would threaten the officers would threaten to resign their commission and go home, just because they were so much against this idea of slaves being let go and freed. About 180,000 black men would enlist to fight for the Northern cause, and obviously their wish to see slavery ended, not hard to see why they would have that motive at all. And as a Kentucky fact, Kentucky actually provides the most African American men to go and fight at 35,000 men. And so you see, slavery does play a big part. It's a big government, economic issue. For some pockets in the North, it's a big moral issue, and things begin to cause this issue around slavery to become inflamed. It is a big issue, but to say that the Northern person, the Northern man, had the motive of fighting to end slavery, it's a very small percentage of them that did.